You know something is wrong when the silence of the forest becomes deafening. Mia felt the weight of the silence pressing on her ears. The dark, dense forest seemed to be watching them. Something was wrong, and although she couldn't pinpoint it, her instincts screamed at her that they shouldn't continue. The car moved slowly, and the air grew thicker with each passing moment. David glanced at her, sensing her unease. Suddenly, a crack, a sharp sound shattered the stillness. Everyone turned their heads in unison. Mia's heart began to race as she tried to spot the source of the noise, but all she saw was darkness. Something moved in the shadows. "Did you see that?" she asked in a low voice, but before anyone could respond, a hand slammed against the rear window of the car, so fast and hard that the glass shook. Mia gasped, her breathing quickening. There was no one behind the car, but the dark, wet mark remained on the glass. Like something had crashed into them and then vanished. The forest was alive, and it was watching them. When they reached the clearing, the sense of unease didn't go away. Everything was eerily quiet, as if the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. As Jake unloaded the gear, his usual humor seemed forced, like he could feel the tension too, but refused to admit it. Night fell quickly, and the campfire was the only thing keeping them tethered to a sense of normality. But the circle of light felt too small, and the forest darkness pressed in, like a predator stalking its prey. Sarah broke the silence with a story about the Watcher, and every word seemed to hang in the air. "They say you never see him, but he's always watching you, waiting for you to slip up." Suddenly, a soft, barely audible whisper came from the forest, like a voice carried on the wind. Everyone froze, straining to listen. The crunch of leaves, then nothing. Unable to bear the tension, David stood up with a flashlight and ventured to the edge of the camp. An object glinted in the darkness. He picked it up, a bracelet, covered in dried blood. "This isn't ours," David muttered, raising his eyes to the forest. A chill ran down his spine as he heard a clear, unmistakable whisper carried on the wind. "Leave." The group was fully on edge now. No one spoke, but they all felt it. Something was alive in the forest, and it wasn't human. Mia, struggling to suppress the rising panic within her, remembered the stories her grandmother used to tell her. This forest wasn't a normal place. Jake, always wanting to play the hero, decided to prove there was nothing to fear. "I'm going to check the perimeter," he said with a forced tone of confidence as he ventured into the trees. But, as he moved farther, his voice became fainter, as if the forest was swallowing him. "Jake," called David, but silence was the only response. Sarah jumped up, her eyes wide. "Jake, this isn't funny." But when she and David went after him, they found only his flashlight, its beam flickering on the ground. Jake was gone. A blood-curdling scream pierced the air, causing them to spin around in panic. David and Sarah ran toward the sound, but when they arrived, there was no sign of Jake, only a symbol carved into a tree trunk, the symbol of the Watcher. The terror was closing in on them. Fear gripped the group. The air felt heavy, as though the forest itself was conspiring against them. Sarah was almost in shock, mumbling to herself, trying to process the horror unfolding around them. Mia couldn't shake the feeling that the forest was hunting them. Suddenly, a dark figure emerged from the trees. There was no doubt now. It was stalking them. It moved swiftly, but not in a human way, almost as if it floated between the shadows. David, in a desperate attempt to protect Mia, charged toward the figure with a branch in his hand, but by the time he reached it, the figure was gone. The tension continued to rise. Sarah screamed as something invisible dragged her into the shadows, her voice quickly swallowed by the trees. Mia's panic was palpable, but she knew running wouldn't help. The forest was alive, and there was no escape. As David and Mia tried to flee, the forest seemed to close in around them, whispering their names. There was no way out. Desperate, Mia and David found temporary refuge in a small abandoned cabin, a brief respite from the horror surrounding them. But the atmosphere inside was just as oppressive. The whispers intensified, as though the very walls were watching them. "He's coming for us," Mia muttered, her hands trembling. David tried to keep his composure, but he knew the end was near. The door of the cabin creaked open slowly, and there it was. The Watcher, a tall, dark, deformed figure that seemed to absorb everything around it. It wasn't just a shadow, it was the darkness itself. an entity that didn't belong to this world. David tried to defend them, but his movements were sluggish, as though the very air had changed. Mia screamed, but her voice was swallowed by the void. The Watcher advanced. The Watcher slowly approached Mia, the whispers wrapping around her like a suffocating fog. The screen fades to black, and the last sound is a whisper carried on the wind. "You can't escape."